The Untold Adventures of Biao. Season 1. Episode 35. On the starry night, when the people in the village were still sleeping, Mr. Gong and Biao were preparing for the fight with Shenlong. At first, Mr. Gong told Biao that they would go to the western riverbank to get help from the underwater yokai. But for some reason, Mr. Gong led Biao to the northern riverbank. There must be something strange here. Dad, you said we would go to the west bank of the river. Why are we going to the north now? Is there any mistake, Dad? Do you think that the yokai will help just because I ask for it? Things are not that simple. Mr. Gong sat down and explained to Biao the situation. He was trying to find some precious things. He hoped to convince that yokai thanks to the treasures. For that 1,000-years-old yokai, it takes a long time to appear once. As far as we know, it has been 20 years since it appeared. To have its support, we must offer something extremely precious to it. Having said that, Mr. Gong took out a precious bracelet from his pocket. Biao saw the treasure, was surprised and immediately asked, "Dad, that is, fortunately, we still keep this." It turned out that it was the jade bracelet that Biao took while exploring the bloody grave. It was an extremely valuable treasure. Biao recognized it immediately. "Dad, that's the bracelet I found before. You didn't sell it along with the other treasures. Can I ask for it again? I still want to give that bracelet to Zhan Ni, this kid." "I said you and Zhan Ni cannot be together. Stop dreaming." Mr. Gong ignored Biao's words. He quietly used his steel wire loop to make a circle next to the river bank, then he placed the bracelet in the middle. "Dad, you used that 100,000's worth bracelet as bait? Is that too wasteful? We must know how to make sacrifices for the cause. This is the only way to lure the animal up. Trust me." After preparing, Mr. Gong told Biao to stay away so the animal could appear. "Let's go. Let's find a place to hide and watch. Hope this animal will appear but still leave the bracelet for me. I want to give it to my Zhan Ni." The father and son hid behind a bush not far away to observe. At this point, Biao asked his father to explain more clearly about changing from the western to the northern riverbank and also about using the precious bracelet to lure the underwater animal. Mr. Gong also did not hide anything from his son and began to tell. "Do you remember when I found the 2 marbles on the spider's body? Those 2 marbles, one is for me, the other is for my friend. It happened more than 20 years ago. The marble was used to being exposed to poison all the time by the spider. So when Mr. Gong got it, he had to find a way to nourish the marble with the poison of other animals. If he couldn't do that, the use of the marble would be lost gradually. That was why Mr. Gong always had a headache and spent a lot of effort to find one. He must find a poisonous animal to keep the jade. After more than a month of searching, finally, Mr. Gong found a spirit toad cultivating in this swamp. Mr. Gong observed the life behavior of this toad for a long time. His ultimate goal was to find a host to store the marble. On that night, the toad took out the gold coin to practice and absorb the essence of the full moon night. Mr. Gong got closer to the swamp. Taking the chance when the toad was absorbing moonlight, Mr. Gong threw the marble nearby. The marble rolled straight to the swamp. It was a marble full of evil spirits, constantly glowing and emitting a strong yin smell. And that was also the reason why it attracted all kinds of cultivating things. The spiriting toad was not an exception. As soon as it saw the marble glowing, it immediately swallowed the gold coin and turned to look at the marble. After observing for a while to see if anyone was around, when it was certain that there was no one, lightning fast, it jumped straight to the marble without hesitation. The marble was full of yin and also deathly poisonous. If normal animals swallowed it, then it would die immediately. However, the toad was cultivating and its whole body was covered with poison. So after swallowing the marble, not only was it not hurt, but on the contrary, it was even more powerful. However, when swallowed for a while, the whole body of the toad trembled and burned. It immediately jumped into the water to cool off the heat from the marble in contact with its body. Since that time, no one saw the toad appeared again. So, Mr. Gong found the host to hold the marble finally. He was very relieved and left. Just like that, the marble was kept for 20 years by the toad. That day, Mr. Gong brought Biao to the swamp to get the marble back. Now it's time for us to get back the marble. Finally, Biao understood the reason. It turned out that his father brought him to this swamp because of that toad. He was talking to Mr. Gong when he noticed that the water began to move violently. It turned out that there was a spirit toad here. "Dad, look, there's movement in the water." At this time, the father and son immediately hid in the bush and continued to observe what would happen. The water's surface was bubbling more and more. It seemed that an animal was about to emerge. Moments later, the toad emerged. It crawled ashore after observing if there were any strangers around. As expected, the father and son prepared to catch the toad. Biao. "Get ready. Prepare to catch it." The toad was fascinated by the bracelet, so it did not discover Mr. Gong and Biao were approaching it. The toad put the bracelet on its neck but did not detect the steel wires that Mr. Gong left before. Mr. Gong launched kunai toward and ordered Biao to cast the net at the same time. Biao reacted immediately and cast the net to catch the toad. "Cast the net now. Don't try to escape. Let me show you my abilities." The toad was controlled by Mr. Gong kunai and then caught by Biao's net. This toad was an extremely venomous and very agile species that was rarely caught. But it was caught by Mr. Gong and Biao. Under the full moon, the father and son pulled the toad up to their side. Then, they put on gloves to avoid poison from the toad. They tied it to a nearby tree. The toad was sticking out its tongue and not moving. It looked like it's dead already. "Dad, is it because we're a little too strong, so it's dead already?" Mr. Gong understood this toad very well. He knew it was playing dead and that was the survival instinct of this toad. "All right, I'm not harming you. Don't play dead anymore." Biao was about to take the gold coin from the toad's body, but his father immediately stopped him. "Dad, this is real gold. Can I take it? This is the treasure that is always with the toad, don't touch it. In its cave, there will be many more treasures." Mr. Gong took out a long needle from his sleeve and walked over to the toad. "I just want to take back what belongs to me. I will absolutely not harm you." Looking closely, the toad's poison caused the trunk to rot. The poison of this toad is really powerful now. Mr. Gong stang 2 needles into 2 acupuncture points in the armpit of the toad. Its whole body trembled with fear of Mr. Gong. The marble that was swallowed 20 years ago was slowly being released. As soon as the marble came out of the toad's mouth, Mr. Gong reached out and caught it. Checking the marble, Mr. Gong found its power increased so much, thanks to being kept inside the toad for the last 20 years. Mr. Gong felt extremely satisfied. He told Biao to release the toad. Mr. Gong discovered that Biao at this time was very enthusiastic, different from the usual laziness and complaining. Something was definitely out of the ordinary. Mr. Gong suddenly remembered talking about the treasure in the cave of the toad. Perhaps this aroused Biao's greed for money. "It's cold and poisonous in the water. Do you really want to dive? How can these simple things stop your son? Dad, look at me." Without saying a word, Mr. Gong only heard Biao jumping into the lake with the toad. This swamp had very few visitors. Partly because the toads guarded, partly because the water here was extremely toxic. But Biao didn't care about those things. Biao followed the toad and seemed to have discovered something. Indeed, there was a sparkling light from the cave of the toad. A few minutes later, Biao emerged. His face was filled with excitement. He must collect a lot of treasures. Biao ran to Mr. Gong and brought out countless gold bars and put them all on the ground. Mr. Gong was also surprised. He thought that to collect this many treasures, the toad must cultivate for several hundred years. Looks like this toad has been cultivating for a few hundred years. Our efforts for this trip are well worth it. Dad, that toad has the ability to find treasures. We have to capture it to enrich our life. Biao sat down. He told his father to make the most of the toad. Mr. Gong immediately told him the story of the toad. Every day it must find treasures so that it could cultivate. This practice existed long ago. There used to be a lot of people who became wealthy thanks to these toads. During the Qing dynasty, a family became rich through the wealth they earned from the toad. Near the citadel, there was a large lake. People dropped things and treasures into the lake by accident and could not get them up. Toads brought all those treasures back to their caves. That family once every 5 years sent someone to retrieve the treasures from the cave. Since then, this family became extremely rich that no one could match. Biao was very interested in hearing his father talk about this matter. Dad, can we raise that toad, Dad? Then we won't have to worry about money anymore. But the words of Mr. Gong made Biao freeze. He said that because the family's greed impacted the immortal cultivation of the toads, so they later confiscated all of their property, leaving not a single penny. After listening to his father's story, Biao felt a little sorry for the toad. However, he still put all the treasures in his pocket. Seeing Mr. Gong had no reaction to it, so he quickly stood up and prepared to leave. All right, let's pack it up. We still have to go see the old yokai. Yes, Dad. Poor you, Toad. I will catch a lot of insects for you to eat. After the father and son obtained the marble, they moved from the northern to the western riverbank. Upon arriving, Mr. Gong took out the marble. He started talking to himself. This is the treasure I promised to give you that year. Take it. Mr. Gong threw the marble into the water without any hesitation. Biao immediately considered the value of the marble and felt regretful. Biao saw that his father was still extremely calm. He understood that this fight with Shen Long would be very difficult, and the price to pay would certainly not be small. Mr. Gong seemed very confident about the monster in the river. But this time that Shenlong is very strong. You have to be extremely careful. Having said that, Mr. Gong turned back and went home. At that moment, Biao noticed that the water was bubbling. A black shadow was gradually appearing on the surface of the water. Mr. Gong and Biao only saw the red eyes of the yokai. It appeared for a while and then dived into the river again. Immediately after leaving, Biao asked his father about the yokai in the river. Dad, can that yokai fight Shenlong? Does it only need to receive the marble to help us? Mr. Gong always believed in those animals, even more than humans. He was not afraid of them breaking their promise. Don't worry. These animals are very faithful. Absolutely do not do things that are not moral. So the plan of Mr. Gong was somewhat settled. There was soul-revoking owl in the sky to help. On the ground, he had two powerful assistants, corpse-eating dog and heavenly fox. Under the water, there was that mysterious old yokai in charge. That Shenlong turned into a dragon, so it was possible to fly to the sky, walk on the ground or dive underwater. The thoughtful preparation of Mr. Gong was not a waste at all. Dad, so what is that yokai after all? it also belongs to the race of dragons. But it cultivates in a different path.